But there's not really a movement here, right? We do, during isometric contraction, do we build up tension? Do we build up contraction? We do. This is exactly what we do here, right? Myosin heads will continue to pull and pull and pull, but it doesn't result in any actual movement. And that's exactly what we have here. In the cardiovascular contraction, we give it a bit of a different name. We don't call it isometrically, we call it isovolumetrically. So isovolumetrically because of the three-dimensional, not that the muscles don't have a three-dimensional structure, but that's the way we call it. Okay, let's continue. So, going back, we were here, right? We were building pressure, but there's some guys, right? I'm trying to push the door, but there are 4 students leaning against the door, and I'm trying to pull, and they're much stronger than I am, right? So what do I need to do in order to open the door? To build more and more pressure by contracting harder and harder. In our analogy, I will just call other students, right? And we will push the door. At some point, the P, the pressure in the ventricles, is going to exceed, to overcome the pressure in the aorta. What will happen to the valves now? They will open up and the blood will flow. So this is, the third step was what we call ventricular systole, but it's still isovolumetric ventricular systole. There's no actually flow. The second part of this will be ventricular systole, the ejection phase. This is when we are able to eject the blood from the ventricles towards the either pulmonary trunk or the aorta, depending on the side. So ventricular is still in systole. The atria are having the nap, right? They went into diastole. They're still going to wait in diastole until the next cycle. AV valves are still closed for the same reason they were closed earlier on. But the ventricular pressure is now rising. We'll talk a lot about pressure. It's millimeters of mercury, but we'll talk more about it next week when we'll talk about blood pressure. So right now we'll just say the number is 120. That's average, healthy, young person. And then the ventricular pressure exceeds the pressure in the aorta. As a result, blood is expelled into the aorta. And again, it's the same thing goes for the pulmonary trunk in the right side. Any questions about this? First, yes?
Can you explain again why
The AP valves are closed because if you just imagine for a second, okay, that you are in the AV valve. Okay, you're sitting there, you're open, right? But now you're getting hit by blood from the ventricle. So you're being pushed. You're being pushed back towards the atria. Now you are one direction, that one direction only type of valve, so you're not allowing the blood to move to the atria. You also have the chordae and the muscles that contract them. So I'm now, okay, this is the atria behind me, or let's say the right atrium. And this is the ventricles. I'm hit by blood, I'm closed. But I'm not going too much in because there's some chordae that pull me. So I'm right here. Who had Beatrice, I think? Other question? Yeah. It continues to get, the volume of the blood will continue to get smaller because the blood does not really fill the entire chamber, right? Don't forget that pressure is force per area, so not only that we are putting more force, but the area is becoming smaller. As a result, the pressure is becoming even bigger. Yes, that's the idea. Yes? Let's leave the aorta for next week when we'll talk about the vascular system. It's much more than just loading. It's extremely important, has a lot of important elastic properties. Aorta and all the large arteries. Yes? So the pressure in the QRS is the time when you build up the pressure. Again, I emphasize this is not an action potential. This is a building up of all the activity, right? So once you reach the contractile cells, for a given contractile cells, you either fire an action potential or not. But for the entire muscle to contract more and more and more, although they are all in unison, right, it takes a tiny bit of time. But still, in each given cell, they can contract more myosin heads, it takes the calciums a bit of time to go in. Basically the same as we had with the skeletal system, the same idea. Skeletal muscles, right? Yes?
So the AV valves can open when there's pressure.
Leave the AV valves for a second. you're about to ask a great question, but I'm going to lead you guys to that, okay? Before we move on, okay, to what happens here, what we focus on, I want you to pay attention to something new that is happening here. Take a look at the atria in number 4. Let's say the right, but again, it all applies to the left. What's going on there? It's different than the 3 one, right? On the step 3. What do we have there now that is new? We get new bloods. Where is that blood in the right atrium coming from? From the vena cava, right? From the tissues from the previous cycle. The blood is starting to come back. Now the pressure here was 0, right? I have 0 drops, molecules of blood. So it used to be 0 once we got into diastole, after we pushed the blood from the atria to the ventricle. So now it's 0. The blood is coming from the body to the right atrium, and in the case of the left, from the lungs to the left atrium. So I'm starting to have some blood here, which means that I'm also going to start developing what? Pressure. More blood, more pressure. This is still not enough to open the valves because you have a lot of pressure at this point in the ventricles, right? Tons of blood. But after we eject the blood, the ventricles are going to be left with some, not 0, but some blood. The pressure is going to go down in the ventricles in the next step, right? So let's think about the next step. Going to number 5. The ventricles just ejected the blood, most of the blood, so they're going into 1, 2, 3, diastole, right? They're going to relapse. Atria are still in their nap time. They're still in diastole until the next cycle. Let's focus on the semilunar valves. So here's 4 to 5. Step 5, early diastole for the ventricles. Again, the atria are already in diastole a long time ago. The AV valves are still closed, and the semilunar valves are now closed because the ventricular pressure dropped. We just injected a lot of blood towards the aorta or pulmonary trunk. Most of the blood ejected to the aorta, some left at the ventricles, okay, so we have some residual blood here. The atria here, still in diastole, is getting filled with more and more blood from the veins. So remember, I asked you what's going on here, and we said, oh, as they're starting to get the blood from the veins, from the body or lungs, and now they're getting more and more. So the pressure here is increasing. The pressure in the ventricle is, help me, decreasing, right, or decrease because we ejected a lot of the blood. And at some point, the pressure in the atria will overcome, right, will be greater than the pressure in the ventricles. What will happen when the pressure in the atria is going to exceed, to overcome, to be bigger, greater than the pressure in the ventricles? The AV valves will open up. Did we contract the atria at this point? No. So even before the atria are going to contract, that's going to be the next cycle, at some point we're going to reach number 6. There's so much buildup of pressure from the blood coming back from the veins, and now the pressure in the ventricles is not 0, but it's not great. At some point the AV valves will open up, and what we're going to have is a passive, we call it passive ventricular filling. Why passive? Because there's no contraction. So the atria are fed by the blood from the previous cycle, building up pressure. Ventricles just finished their part of the cycle. AV valves open up. Blood is flowing. Beautiful. Maybe this can help us now answer a question that we had earlier on. Can anyone remind me the question that I promise you will address today? Diego? Wonderful. It's a question about the SA node. I'm just copying the question, pasting the question here. We asked, how come if the SA node is compromised and the AV can take over, how come we are able to survive? Because the SA node right here is not functioning, the AV node functions, the ventricles will contract, but the atria do not contract. Now we know the answer. About 2/3 of the blood flow from the atria to the ventricles is passive. So even if the atria fail to contract, still 2/3 of the blood will go back into the ventricle. Is that efficient? Of course not. That's not good. And don't forget, the AV nodes are even slower, that's not good, but you're not going to die in the next 2 minutes. You're just going to have not as efficient cardiovascular system, and you need to be treated with a artificial pacemaker. That's it. And with that, we reach number 6, which was number 1 where we started. So now we're ending at the end of this cycle with everything in diastole. Okay? Now we have AV valves open. We understand now, hopefully, why they're open. And if you don't worry. I know it's really confusing. Just process, go back to this, make sure you understand each step. While we have blood flow that is passive now from the atria to the ventricles, even before the atria contract, the next step will be P wave, contraction, and so on and so forth. This is a summary of all of this that I'm not going to go over again, and you guys will go over the slides and make sure you understand this. Let's see, just a summary. Blood moves from an area of high pressure to one of lower pressure. Pressure is a result of systolic contraction and diastole of the cardiac muscle. During diastole, the chamber fills with blood and prepares for the next cardiac cycle. Heart systole and diastole refer to ventricular systole and diastole if we do not mention something specific, as they produce far greater pressures which force blood pressure to circulate. So if we just say heart systole and diastole, what we mean is ventricular. Everything we discussed in the last, 30 minutes or so, less than 1 second. If you did not think your body is amazing, this is the time to appreciate your body. All of this. Okay, I'm going to continue. I know that for many of you, this is just too much to process right now. Again, go back one step at a time. There's a lot here. Just make sure you understand what opens the valves, what closing them, systole, diastole, why, and so on and so forth. With that, we're not yet going to talk about regulation. We're not going to talk about it at all today, but we're going to prepare ourselves for discussion on regulation. And we're going to talk about some determinants that will be important. So when we talk about volumes of chambers, we're going to talk about 2 important determinants. And I will just say, as I will say next week when we'll talk about regulation, that if you really need to memorize something, these will be the only 2 factors. After that, we will talk about some other factors, but it's basically following logic. So once you know what EDV and ESV are, you're good. And once you use your logic, you're good. So the first one is called the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood in a fully relaxed ventricle. Another way to think about the term end diastolic volume, it means just before systole, just before it's about to contract. So it's a full chamber, but specifically here we talk about ventricles. We care about the ventricles in this story. In an average, healthy, young person, it's about around 120 mLs of blood. Varies, of course, but that's kind of like an average. And systolic volume is the volume that is left in the ventricle after contraction, after systole. Please note, not the blood that left, but not the blood that left towards the aorta, but the blood that is left inside the ventricle that was not ejected. Again, in a healthy person, around 50 mils. How many of you took Calc 1 already? Impressive, majority of the class. How much volume of blood in one single heartbeat, in one cardiac cycle, is leaving the ventricles, knowing these numbers? 1, 2, 3, 70. Wonderful. You're going with your calculus fine. We give this term stroke volume. Give it a name, we call it stroke volume or SV. The amount of blood pumped out by the ventricles during each heartbeat. Not a given time, a heartbeat in one cardiac cycle. And again, in an average, healthy, young person, about 70 mils. Any questions about our determinants? When we want to measure the efficiency of a machine, we need also to provide another factor, and that's time. Maybe you do something that is wonderful, but you do it very, very slowly, and that's not so effective. So we are now going to add another part that is time. Instead of talking about a per beat, we're going to see how we're doing per minute. So the next factor will be cardiac output, CO. cardiac output, in simplistic words, is how much you're in shape, how well your blood works. If you go and you're not so much in shape and you start jogging and everything and you go back in shape, what you're actually saying, I'm improving on my cardiac output. My heart is going to work more efficiently. It's the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle into the aorta in 1 minute. All this sentence, amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle into the aorta, if I stop it here, period, this is what we call what? 1, 2, 3. Not good enough for me. I want to hear the entire word. Again, if I put a period stop here, this is called 1, 2, 3. Stroke volume, wonderful. So it's stroke volume per 1 minute. I know already how to calculate stroke volume, right? EDV, take away ESV. How do I calculate what's the next part? What do I need to do? Beats per minute, right? How many beats I have per minute? Which is called the heart rate. So CO equals stroke volume times heart rate, the amount of blood ejected in each heartbeat, and then the number of beats per minute. That's very simple. Let's talk numbers a bit, okay? So this is, again, we talked about the stroke volume. Heart rate changes dramatically between different people. We just take an average of 75 beats per minute, okay? Calc 2, probably not as many students. Who took Calc 2? Raise your hand. Woohoo, more than I thought. Okay, what is our cardiac output?
5250.
I need the number. You are allowed to use like a calculator if you need. Need some numbers. You can just shout it. You don't need to raise your hands.
52.
How much? Nice. Okay, Kara is the first one to say that, right? It's about 5.25 liters, 5,250 mils per minute. I have a question for you, not related to this one. Please don't do it at home. But if you go home and you basically take all the blood out of your system, you take a barrel or whatever that's going to be, a huge tank, I guess, right? All of this is out there. Everything from capillaries to arteries. Don't do it. Then how much do you have? Around. It doesn't have to be inaccurate.
20 liters?
Tens of gallons, tons. Whoa, how much?
20 liters.
6 what? We have, it's a bit less than 6 liters, but that's the scale. It's about around 5 liters. I talked about how impressive of a machine we have, right? Think about it for a second. We are basically taking our whole blood and running it through our heart in 1 given minute. And we do it in 60 minutes an hour and 24/7 until our heart stops functioning. All the time. Your entire blood, every given minute. That's basically the idea. Entire blood supply passes through the heart once every minute, which is pretty incredible. Okay, so we covered this, and now let's talk again, we're back into the cardiac output. So this is what we call the resting cardiac output. All of this, what I said, was just as you are here now, sitting here and studying, right? You didn't run, you didn't do anything. But let's see what happens if you go and exercise a bit. So the stroke volume is going to be different. First off, you're going to increase, we will talk about it, that as we are exercising or just running, we are increasing what we call the venous return, the blood returning from the veins. Next week we'll talk a bit about some mechanisms of how you do that. So the blood that comes back into your heart, first to the right atrium, then right ventricle, and eventually to the left ventricle, is going to be greater in volume compared to the resting state. So that's going to be 120, but around 145. Everything is around there. We will also see that the ESV is going to become lower. Not only that we put more blood, but we eject even more blood. Why? Because we have mechanisms that we will discuss next week. We just take it as a given now. So you can go up to 115 instead of 70. The heartbeat, as anyone here who had any chance to run knows, that it's going to go up. right? And if you really go into an exercise, you're going to be 180, maybe 190. So we're talking about 22 or so liters. That's 4 times more than the resting state. Okay? We call this the cardiac reserve. Difference between maximum cardiac output and resting cardiac output. And I mentioned the fact that the cardiac output is simplistically telling you how much you're in shape. The cardiac reserve is really what you can change when you are getting into shape. So for anyone here is like an endurance, not athlete, official, like professional athlete, but that's running a marathon, for example. Anyone here? Come on, any marathon, be proud. That's a great achievement. Only 1, 2. Okay, half marathons? Okay, I can join that part. Okay, so we have a few. And a well-trained endurance athlete may have cardiac reserve of 35 liters. That's 600% of the normal. That's a lot, okay? So when we talk about this machine called the heart, it's not just to provide those crazy numbers that we saw earlier on to run all the blood through the heart in every minute, but you also need to find a way to make it so flexible so you can go with all these crazy numbers when you are running away from the tiger that hunts you, okay, that runs after you in nature. But at the same time, you need to go back because you don't want the heart to beat in 190, right, beats per minute all the time. That's not working. A machine that needs to adjust itself. And this is what we're going to do in our next section that we'll just introduce today. Basically, how we regulate cardiac outputs. How can we make it so much bigger, and then how can we bring it back when needed? And we're going to talk about the mechanisms not only because they're important and interesting, but also because in this class, I don't have the luxury to go to each and every system and go deep, 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 deep. So I prefer just every now and then to talk about concepts and to use them as paradigms, right? We did it, for example, when we talk about the thyroid gland, regulation, negative feedback, and so we didn't go into each and every gland and look at the negative feedback, but we just use one to understand the concept. It applies to all the other negative feedbacks. Here we're going to focus on the heart because it's going to bring us back to the nervous system, it's going to bring us back to the endocrine system, and we will see basically how we regulate, how we reach homeostasis of the heart. Of course, we will not touch everything, but we'll touch quite in depth. As I mentioned earlier, throughout the next slides, use your logic, not so much your memory. Remember what EDV, so you have it answer in a second. Remember your EDV and ESV, remember what is cardiac output and so on. But the most common mistake that I saw students doing is just going and remember this formula and saying this is up, this is down, just by remembering. They're coming to the exam, they blank out because of the stress or what have you, and then they're missing stuff that they really know. So what I'm trying to argue is that if you understand the logic later on, then even if you don't memorize anything, but I'm just telling you what will happen if the EDV goes up, you'll be able to say anything, everything. But it doesn't always work with logic. This is working here.
How does the increase? Because if it's the body fat, the ventricular wall that's fully relaxed, how does it hold more?
So how does it hold more? We will talk about it next week, but I'll just say a word, which is what Abby was asking, how can we increase the EDV? For example, increase venous return. So it's basically like going into the system, and in the middle it will say, boom, uplift it, push more blood, and then everything will start running again. But we will see how it works. Any other question? Sio.
How does this correspond to the normal heart rate?
Wonderful. So I'm actually going to address this. We will, first of all, you know what, before we even go into that one, right? If you increase the heart rate, never mind how you do that. Will you increase stroke volume, or will you increase cardiac output or decrease cardiac output? Increase, right? It's just logic. You just go, even if you don't remember the formula, it makes sense. So Sarah is saying something right. Athletes are known in many cases to have a basic resting lower heart rate. How does this work? Anyone guess? Yeah. Because what they do is basically they can have with a lower heart rate to push, to pump more blood. Okay, the machine is more effective. Now, if you had a machine and you wanted to work it 60 times per minute versus 45 times per minute, and you want to keep the machine as much as you can, what would you do? You would choose the 45, right? Because it works less. That's exactly what happened with the athletes. The heart is just working more efficiently, and each beat, it pumps more blood compared to the non-athlete. That's exactly the case. But do remember, those 45 are at a resting state. It's not that it's not going to increase. We will also see that you can also have heart rate to solve the problem of increased blood pressure, and all of these next week. Okay? So we're just going to start before we go and talk about the actual factors. So how can we change our cardiac output so dramatically? This is our CO, either stroke volume and heart rate, and they are not mutually exclusive. So this is a very big picture that we will know much more about next week. The heart rate we can change either through the endocrine system and or, they're not again mutually exclusive through the nervous system. And I mentioned already autonomic because we're talking about the cardiac muscle, right? So this is autonomic. The stroke volume will also involve these two. But now we're going to change. We said stroke volume is end-diastolic volume minus end-systolic volume. So you can change either one or the other, or you can change both. That's the way we're going to work. The one thing that I want us to remember already now, before we talk about it next week, is as we will see, we have intrinsic and extrinsic mechanisms. What does it mean? Intrinsic, internal, right? Extrinsic, outside. But when we talk about an organ, the heart or the cardiovascular system, when we say extrinsic, we don't mean something from the environment, my friend. What can be intrinsic to the cardiovascular system? The nervous system and the endocrine system. That's extrinsic. What is intrinsic? Stuff going on inside the cardiovascular system. So if I'm increasing venous return, there's more blood running in the system, and that increases EDV. Is that intrinsic or extrinsic? That's intrinsic, because there's more blood in the cardiovascular system without me turning any switch from the hormones or any switch from the nervous system. Okay, so just remember intrinsic and extrinsic, because that's important when we'll start to talk about this. And we'll talk about this next week. Okay? Have a wonderful weekend.